So we've been looking at interactions between limbic system and the cortex and going through this theme of top-down regulation by the frontal cortex, specifically the prefrontal cortex. First looking at it in the cognitive realm and then transitioning to the social realm, where that's what it's about. The prefrontal cortex did not evolve for us to quickly count numbers backwards. It evolved for sociality. The more social your primate species, the more of your brain you're devoting to that part of the cortex, the more it is enhanced by sociality, all of that. So looking down at all the ways in which it is regulating. And what we saw was this particular sort of picture of what happens when you damage the prefrontal cortex. And this is our world of Phineas Gage and frontal temporal dementia. And there's an immensely important point, I think, towards the end there. 25 to 75% of men, depending on the study, men sitting on death row in this country have a history of concussive head trauma to the front of their brain, to the frontal cortex. Highly, highly relevant. So, one more piece of top-down frontal regulation, and this was an immensely interesting, important study done some years ago by Josh Green at Harvard, and this was a Science or Nature paper, I can never remember which. Famously, the title was something like Will or Grace. Will or Grace. What's this about? The title was actually longer, but it had those two concepts in there. What he was looking at was the neurobiology, what was going on with brain imaging of subjects while they had the opportunity to cheat, to lie. You sit there and being clairvoyant, so they were testing for, you say whether you think the computer's coin flip now is going to come up heads or tails. And if you were right, it then flips it. You get a reward of some sort and highly motivated to do that. So people are cruising along with that. And then the experiment starts, which is some deception. Suddenly, the researchers say, oh, damn, some sort of computer hiccup here where we're having trouble taking in what your prediction is beforehand. So we'll just run the coin flips and then tell us afterward if you were correct or not. An opportunity to cheat. Here's your chance to cheat. And as shown here, what went on was, here's where that would suddenly happen. And after 3 of those, came up tails. Did you happen to say tails? Good for you. Hooray, congratulations. Good, we just got the computer back on. Oh, damn, again, it's doing it again. So let's do some more of those. Just tell us if you were right or not. Some more. In other words, a whole bunch of periods where people could have cheated. And they looked at the people who did and didn't. How can you tell who cheated? And what you see is when you're really doing the task, you got a 50-50 chance of being correct on any given round, unless you're clairvoyant, and no one turned out to be. So you have a 50-50 chance. And thus, if you see somebody who is suddenly doing significantly better than 50-50 during these possible cheat periods, you know they were cheating, or you were very, very confident of that. So what you saw was like 75-80% of the subjects cheated. Cheated not necessarily every single time, but at least some of them not, all of that. And the question became, of course, what was going on in their brains. And what you saw was in their prefrontal cortex, there was a burst of activity each time the opportunity for cheating came up. Ooh, should I do it? Should I not do it? Satan, don't tempt me, all of that. Do I give in or not? They were not able to tell the difference between increases where somebody resisted and somebody gave in. But nonetheless, this was the profile. People wrestling with temptation and about 75-80% of them giving into it. And then we transitioned to the subset of people who appeared to have never ever cheated. And here's where the concept of will versus grace come in. What's up with people who never cheated? Do they have the most amazing willpower on earth that they could just put Satan in a headlock and resist all of that? Were they showing willpower? And this is what the willpower would look like in those folks, which opportunities to cheat. And each time the prefrontal cortex explodes into activity and resisting that siren call of cheating and all that. And this is the profile of people with spectacular willpower and moral compass who are able to fight off temptation and never cheat. The alternative model would be someone for whom PFC activity looked like this. There was no temptation. There was no devil to wrestle with. This was not a function of willpower. This is simply who I am. This is simply who I became. It's not doing the harder thing. And we will come back to this study many, many times down in the future of this course. Okay, a few more bits about the prefrontal cortex talking down to the limbic system. And we already saw one example of it. Fear conditioning, bell, shock, bell alone. Amygdala activates, you get a fear response. And the next day, it's not working that way anymore. And it's the prefrontal cortex that's sending the inhibitory signal down to the amygdala saying, yes, 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 yesterday, a bell meant horrible things. But have you noticed? Not today, not today. And prefrontal cortex inhibiting the amygdala. And you better bet when we get to the depression lecture, a whole sort of psychotherapeutic approach called cognitive behavioral therapy is essentially taking that and turning that into an overall therapeutic approach. Yes, yes, yes. Yesterday when the little bell went on, you got a shock. But that doesn't mean it's the case today, and in fact, it's not the case today. Or, in the psychotherapeutic setting, yes, 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 you were abandoned when you were a kid. You failed at whatever. This was unrequited, whatever. Yes, that was real, but that's not today. That is not your inevitable today. And in a sort of writ small kind of way, what that's about is your prefrontal cortex being able to get your limbic system to tell the difference between what was and what is, and what isn't necessarily an inevitable future. Another example of this, a finding we will get to that is extremely distressing, but you put people in a brain scanner and you're flashing of pictures of faces. And I think I've probably already mentioned this, but what you see is in well-replicated studies in about 75% of white subjects, you flash up the face of someone who is black, and in under 1/10 of a second, the amygdala activates. Oh, crap. We are going to be dissecting that finding big time, seeing that it is not quite as horrifyingly depressing as one might think, and looking at who the 25% are, and there's a way to make the percentage more, and what does it actually mean, etc., etc. But right now, the most important thing about it is you see this burst of amygdaloid activation, and a second or two later, in most of these individuals, the prefrontal cortex activates and the amygdala goes silent. What's that? That's the prefrontal cortex sending that inhibitory projection down, which is saying, don't think that way. That's not who I am. That's not who an inhibitory self-control or self-regulation coming in after that. There's a subset of individuals whose amygdalas activate within that 1/10 of a second where you don't see the prefrontal cortex activating again after a delay and shutting down the amygdala. Who are they? Avowed, proud, unapologetic, remorseless white supremacists. They don't need their prefrontal cortex to tell them, hey, stop thinking that way. That's not who I am. That is who I am, and I mean it. Another example of this. This is one of the all-time, evil studies that could be done to you as a volunteer, which is you are socially ostracized. you're put in, I may have described this format already, but you're sitting there at a computer screen and there's 3 X's. You are this X, and you were told these 2 X's are people in either rooms. They're not really people, they're computers. In any case, there is a cyber ball, a ball that you toss back and forth. You throw it to this person, you throw in that one back and forth. And at some point, they start ostracizing you. They don't throw the ball to you. They just throw it back and forth between each other. This is incredibly upsetting. This is incredibly upsetting in a very limbic sort of way. How do you know that? Because if you tell the person instead, oh, damn, we just lost the contact to the other 2 rooms. You can't get on. They're not intentionally ostracizing you. For the average subject, being told this was a computer rather than intentional, you didn't have the amygdaloid response. But in the primary version of the study, you're being ostracized. They're not throwing the ball to you anymore. All of that, this is so upsetting. And the amygdala roars into action. And 2, 3, 5, 10 seconds later, prefrontal cortex activates and inhibits the amygdala. What is that about? That's the prefrontal cortex saying, wait a second, this is a stupid game. You're not 12 years old with acne in middle school anymore. This says, you have friends, you have loved ones, you have all that. Like, put this in perspective, my God. And the amygdala silences, and you've put things in perspective. Now, there's a subset of humans where you put them in the brain scanner with this, and you do this cyberball ostracizing thing, and they've been ostracized and left out, and their amygdala is going like crazy, and you barely see the prefrontal cortex coming on after a lag, and you barely see the amygdala being quiet and stuff. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. Who are these people? Teenagers with their not yet fully mature prefrontal cortex and their frantic need for conformity and fitting in and all of that. And nothing is worse than socially being ostracized, and the 3.5 working neurons in the prefrontal cortex in the teenager at that point hasn't a clue, hasn't a prayer of doing anything like saying, no, this is just a game, and keep it in perspective, and all of that doesn't make a dent in it. Okay, so what we see, one additional step with this is this power of reappraisal. James Gross in the psychology department has done some wonderful work with this emotionally distressing thing, and can you reframe its meaning? Can you, and we saw an example of that, reframing its meaning as in, this is a stupid game. Reframing its meaning as in, no, you failed because you got woken up in the middle of the night by whatever and you were exhausted during the exam, getting some situational explanation, things of that sort. It is central to the prefrontal cortex saying, don't run away with this, keep this in perspective. So what we switch to now is the flip side, the limbic system talking to the prefrontal cortex. And this was viewed as completely absurd and impossible back when. The entire purpose of neuroanatomical connections between the cortex and the limbic system is for the cortex to keep the limbic system from doing something stupid and impulsive. All top-down inhibition. And as we've already heard, every time you are strongly emotional about something and make a terrible impulsive decision, you've just showed the limbic system can talk to the prefrontal cortex. And what you see during periods of stress is the prefrontal projection to the amygdala weakens. The amygdala projection back to the prefrontal cortex gets more powerful, saying, do this dumbass, disinhibited, imprudent thing because this seems like the most brilliant thing on earth right now. And that's where you get emotions overriding judicious decision-making. Literally, the amygdala having more control over the prefrontal cortex than the other way around. And people know exactly how those glucocorticoid stress hormones weaken the descending PFC projection, strengthen the ascending amygdaloid one. So, you got if nothing else, evidence of this. The limbic system could talk to the cortex, can take it over at times. And again, this was viewed as totally absurd back when, and almost ruined the career of this guy, like the 20th century's greatest neuroanatomist, this guy named Vali Nauda, Dutch guy, Vali Nauda, who spent his career at MIT and in like the 1960s first reported that he was seeing a lot of projections from the limbic system up into the frontal cortex. And in fact, he was seeing so many that he said in his mind, parts of the prefrontal cortex should count as honorary limbic system. Oh my God, what a great scientist. And he just destroyed his career. Is he taking drugs? What happened to him? Oh, he was so respected, just doing himself in with anything as absurd as the limbic system is talking to the cortex, and let alone that is talking so much that the portal by which the limbic system talks to the prefrontal cortex should be considered like some sort of honorary part of the limbic system. He was widely ostracized. No one would toss the ball to him in games of catch. His family deserted him, all of that. And of course, he turned out to be right. And of course, he didn't bother with any I told you so's. He was unflappable in that regard. Actually, totally amazing man. One of my heroes. Every few years, he taught this course, his famous evening course in neuroanatomy. And like chiefs of neurosurgery all over the planet would take sabbaticals to come and take Nauda's course as a refresher. And you'd sit there and it was like from 7 to 11 in the evening in the dark looking at slides. And like neuroanatomy is the most boring thing on earth. And I loved it. I loved how bored I was and loved how hard it was to fight to stay awake because this stuff was totally cool. He was this really like Olympianly wise person, all of that. And then I wound up working in a lab just down the hall from his lab. And as long as like this is all remote, I might as well get confessional here, something I fell into the habit of doing. I'd be sitting at my desk or something, and I would see Professor Nauda walk past down the hall. Where's he going? What's down the hall? The bathroom, the men's room. And I would leap up and time things carefully. So I would just step out from sort of the door to the lab I was working in, just as I heard the bathroom door close and opening, just so I could pass him in the hallway and say, "Oh, good afternoon, Professor Nauda. How are you today?" And he would nod to me in this very stately kind of way, and that would make me a wonderfully Olympian guy who stuck to his guns about the limbic system talking to the frontal cortex. And it's only later that I found out, dealing with people saying Nauda is completely lost it here doing this limbic cortical nonsense stuff, that was trivial for him. It was only later that I found out that as a young man newly married with a child in Amsterdam during the Nazi occupation, his family sheltered refugees in their apartment for years on end, where they would have been dead in a second if they were ever discovered. And I read recently one of these people, this girl who they sheltered there for 4 years secretly, recently died at age 92. So that on top of it. So Vali Nauda, hero of limbic projections into the prefrontal cortex. He turned out to be right. Okay, so what did he find? He found a particular part of the prefrontal cortex, which is where all of the limbic stuff funneled in to the prefrontal cortex. And this was an area called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Oh my God, if you haven't had neuroanatomy, this is like ventro, dorsal, along the top of the brain, ventral, along the bottom, medial, in the middle, lateral, out to the sides, frontal, rostral, Latin for the back of your head or what. So this is just saying it's the part of the prefrontal cortex that's medial along the midline and ventral towards the bottom. The ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So this was this honorary little limbic portal through which all of this limbic information was pouring in. And this soon came to be contrasted with the most cerebral, cold, remorseless, analytical part of the prefrontal cortex, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And dorsolateral, interestingly, we've now gone through this sort of hierarchy. The cortex is the most recent part of the brain to evolve in mammals. The frontal cortex is the most recent part in primates to expand a whole lot. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the frontal cortex that's most recently expanded. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is the newest part of the prefrontal cortex to undergo a big expansion. What is it about? It's about decision making. It is at the heart of executive function. Ventral medial prefrontal tells what's going on bubbling underneath in the limbic basement there and who's getting all frothy about what. And they're two remarkably contrasting parts of the brain. For example, classic problem in philosophy, and we will be getting back to it, the runaway trolley problem. Since Plato, people have been thinking about runaway trolleys. Here's the scenario. You got a trolley, the track, its brakes fail, whatever, and it's run down the track there out of control, and inconveniently there's 5 people tied to the track at that point, and they're about to all be killed by the trolley, and you have to make a choice right now. Standing in front of you is an individual, and you can pull a lever which will dump them onto the track. And as a result of being dumped on, way before those 5 people, as a result of being dumped on, the trolley is going to hit them and get gummed up in their remains and stop at that point. They're dead, but the 5 people are safe. Would you pull the lever? Is it okay to sacrifice 1 to save 5 and all sorts of utilitarian stuff? And we're going to see some really interesting elaborations on this. I'm including more work by that guy, Josh Green at Harvard, who as a grad student did the runaway trolley problem with people in a brain scanner, looking at how they went about making decisions. And what he saw was a huge classic dichotomy between a dorsolateral PFC-ish sort of scenario and a ventral medial one. First scenario, do you pull a lever or not that will dump this person on the track? And what he would see is, regardless of the person's decision, high activation here. This was okay. Let's figure out what I think of utilitarian philosophy and who's a freshman year TA who taught me this or that about Immanuel Kant. All the alternative version. Here comes the trolley about to kill people. Do you push the person with your own hands onto the track? And what you see is in circumstances where about 75% of people say they would pull a lever, only about 25% would push with their own hands. And Green has explored all sorts of variants on that. What is it that is so salient, that is so real when you are going to do it with your hands as opposed to pulling a lever? It's totally logical equivalent, yet dramatically different answers. Cold, mechanistic pulling of a lever versus you are going to feel the person's body resisting as you push them to their death, all of that. Do I pull the lever or not? Activation here. Do I use my hands or not? Activation here, and a whole bunch of limbic sites. So that gives you a flavor of the contrast between dorsolateral PFC ventral medial. Another version, you put people through a mock jury trial as jurors, and then they're deliberating afterward. When they're deliberating whether or not somebody is guilty, or this is somebody in a brain scanner and you explain what the scenario was and they have to decide innocent or guilty. When they're contemplating that, trying to decide innocent or guilty, it's being processed here. Once they decide guilty, now they decide what the punishment is, and that flips over to being a limbic sort of thing. And we're going to see in the aggression lectures down the line a hugely complicated thing in terms of making the world a better place, is the fact that We like punishing. Punishment activates the dopamine system. So, guilty or not, let me consider the facts. Punishment. What do they deserve to undergo? How angry am I? And you could see things like the more activation of the amygdala, predictive of more severe the punishment, funneling up by way of this, telling this, what's your decision? More examples. Guilt and shame are two very, very different psychological states. We'll eventually get into whether there are strong cultural differences, a guilt culture versus a shame culture. And see, there's a guilt is about facts, is about yet shame is about cultural opprobrium. I don't know if I've ever tried to say that word before. I may have left out a syllable, but activate different parts. The dorsolateral, I got them backwards, heartless. The dorsolateral PFC is about tax day and the ventral medial is about Valentine. Okay, so you got a contrast between these two areas. So the question becomes sort of what are they doing functionally in different circumstances? And you can see dorsolateral is sort of like the most extreme version of much of what the PFC is about. This is this weirdo outpost bringing in this emotional information. What does it look like when there is damage to these areas? Damage, first off, to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. You get kind of a mini version of Phineas Gage, of somebody with frontotemporal dementia. You get somebody who is socially inappropriate. This is someone who does sexually inappropriate things, says rude, offensive, disinhibited things, all of that. You see what it looks like without the most rational part of your prefrontal cortex telling your limbic system, ooh, I know you're thinking that, but do not say that. Do not do that. You will regret it. And this is weakened here. The descending projection is not doing as well as usual if this is damaged. So, what happens if you have damage to the ventral medial prefrontal cortex? And here it all comes down to whether or not you think like Mr. Spock is the coolest thing on earth. This whole realm of people who strongly dichotomize between thought and emotion, probably at a much higher than chance level. When you get someone like that, they're rooting for thought. Emotion just like gums up the works with sentimentality, and it gets all weepy and gets all frothy and stuff. And like if you could just like cut the emotional part out of your rational decision making up there, this would be a much more sensible world, all of that. And then you've got the small subset of people say cognition versus emotion. If only we can get rid of cognition and just run on emotion, and like we're all one and we love everything, especially whales and elephants and stuff. And okay, false dichotomy, we know that already. So what does it look like if the prefrontal cortex is not getting emotional information from the limbic system? What you might predict right off the bat is one of the things you see. These are people who are heartlessly utilitarian in the decision making that they make. And runaway trolley problems every single time, like pull the lever, push the person, disembowel them before tossing them on the track, disembowel, and it's your mother you're doing it to. They do not distinguish between relatives and strangers in terms of what they claim to be the moral decisions they would make. This is bizarre. This is so bizarre that virtually every state in the country says close relatives are a special category. Because evidence, you cannot be compelled in court to testify against a close relative. Justice is blind, be damned. People, close relatives, that's a different category. You can't do that to people. Damage this part of the brain, and identical twin versus stranger versus quagga, zebra, or something, and they're all the same. They're making the exact same decisions. What's even more interesting is people with damage to this part of the brain, not only do they make these heartlessly utilitarian decisions, they have enormous trouble making decisions about anything. What is this about? And here's where we got all sorts of insights from that same guy, Antonio Damasio, is the person with SM, with the amygdaloid damage. Damasio, what he sort of put forth is what's known as the somatic marker hypothesis, hugely informatory and important. Okay, why are you having trouble making a decision if there's damage to this part of the brain? And what Damasio showed and expanded on is you have trouble doing that because you're not getting any gut feelings when you're making a decision. You're not having any intuitive sense down there of, is this a good idea or bad? You get no gut feeling input at all coming in there, and thus making everyday decisions are incredibly difficult. What he emphasized also is not only are you running a thought experiment, you are running a feel experiment. How is it going to feel if I do this and this turns out to be the consequence? What if that's the consequence? How would it feel if I were that person and I did this? How would this feel? And wonderfully poetic term that he used, this is the limbic system, by way of here generating an emotional memory of the future. How is it going to feel? And this somatic marker hypothesis is basically a local version of that James Lang theory from the other week, the other day, whatever. Ooh, how intensely do I feel this emotion? Well, if my heart's beating like crazy, I must be feeling a very intense version of this emotion. How do I feel about making this decision? Well, if the limbic system is saying, oh my God, it will be so heartbreaking if this is the outcome. Think about how it will feel. Feel about how it will feel. This, nonetheless, is a value-free fact, as in it could cut both ways. Sometimes you need to have limbic input to say, oh my God, it is going to feel so terrible if these people are harmed, and thus go out and do this heroic thing, even though rationally that seems like maybe too terrifying. Go do the right thing, hooray for you. And just as readily, oh my God, it's going to feel so terrible killing these infants and stuff, but you know who they're going to grow up to be like, so you got to overcome. It's value free, just as doing the harder thing as a general state is a neurobiological assessment. It is not a value judgment. Sometimes using emotion to do a feel experiment can make you more empathic, or it can make you far more brutal. Okay, a little bit more back to the dopamine system, which we heard lots about the other day. The whole point being it's about reward, but even more so, it's about anticipation, and even more so, it's about the motivated work you're willing to do in anticipation of. It's essential for that. Uncertainty blows the roof off of the dopamine system, is extremely, extremely motivating. And we saw that piece there where simply because the system habituates so quickly, what was a wonderful surprise yesterday is what you feel entitled to today and isn't going to be anywhere near enough tomorrow. Why should it work that way? Because it turns out it works in us very, very dramatically so. As follows, you take a baboon. What in the life of a baboon counts as pleasurable? I don't know, food, you kill something exciting and you get to eat it by yourself, or sex, or you win some dominance interaction, or like life is relatively restricted when it comes to sources of pleasure and anticipation for other species. But then there's us. And what are our sources of pleasure? Everything from like being the first person to clone a gene to like transcendent religious ecstasy and smelling flowers, the first one in spring, and winning the lottery. And we've got this massive range of potential sources of pleasure and anticipation. Yet, We've got the same old dopamine system that like every other beastie out there has. Ours has to be different though, because it has to be able to change the scale very quickly. Some of the time, 0 to 10 in your dopamine system means maximal, some abstract thing that's mildly pleasurable, and some of the time 0 to 10 is like cocaine or something. It needs to rapidly habituate. It needs to rapidly reset so that you're sitting there and like your dopamine system has gone up to 10, it's gone up to 11 on your scale of 1 to 10 because of like the most amazing orgasm, whatever. And then you need to be able to say, okay, rescale now, because now we're going to do haikus. And whoa, you better be set to be able to recognize the haiku that puts the scale up to 11, because now we're doing haikus. We're not doing, sexuality. You need to be able to reset all the time. And first bits of anatomical evidence for this is coming out, some studies in the last year. This group, where are they? Ohio State, showing, okay, we've got ventral tegmentum, talks to the nucleus accumbens, talks to the ventral medial PFC, talks to the dorsal lateral PFC, just our whole cascade by which anticipation, motivation, all of that is influencing decision making. And what they're seeing is when you look at these structures in a human brain versus other primate brains, in the human brain, you see a lot more feedback loops going on in there rather than just one big one. There's more fine control. There's more regulation. Neuroanatomy types, what you see is incredibly high densities and human versions of these of somatostatin containing interneurons that do inhibitory little feedback loops. You've got to have a system that is much more tightly regulated with feedback signals so you can do the reset. Okay, we're doing Nobel Peace Prizes right now. No, we're doing solving Sudoku. We're doing that instead right now. So rescale what counts as 0 and what counts as maximal. You see this wiring for that. And that's totally amazing. And that's how we manage to both like having like somebody scratch our back when we have an itch that's making us crazy, and like writing, Beethoven's Ninth or whatever. The system has to habituate, reset, rescale quickly. And that's the reason why what was a great dopaminergic surprise yesterday, you've reset that this is now expected, and tomorrow is going to, and more of human misery is built around this one diagram and the fact that this system has to reset. This is the neurobiology of why we're hungry. And we just get more and more hungry, and we're never satiated. And the more you eat, the hungrier you get. And what was amazing is going to be too little tomorrow. This, I think, is like the neurochemistry of a core piece of the human predicament. Okay, last number of cortical structures interacting with the limbic system. One of them, the fusiform cortex. Fusiform cortex, first discovered by someone named Nancy Kamenisch at MIT in the 1980s. The fusiform cortex is a primate specialty. What is it good for? Recognizing faces. Oh, does that ever make sense? Although I'll see down the line, probably pigeons can recognize individual human faces. But nonetheless, the fusiform cortex is this whole dedicated part of the cortex that's like there, whopping large amounts of primates compared to everybody else for recognizing faces. Yeah, if all that like cortical social intelligence is doing is playing out in terms of like important frontal function, blah, blah, all of that, you got to be really good at recognizing individuals. And this is a part of the brain devoted to that. So, hooray, we've evolved a facial recognition brain region. Turns out to be much more interesting, the fusiform, in that it isn't there to recognize faces, different examples of faces, different examples in this category of face, What it really does is it recognizes different examples of whatever category of things really, really are meaningful to you. And thus, you will get some fanatic bird watcher, whatever, where you flash up pictures of different bird species and the fusiform cortex activates. You get somebody who's like crazy about, I don't know, classic model sports cars, and it will activate in response to different ones. You get somebody and you flash up faces of different baboons, and their fusiform will process that, all of that. So fusiform is, in principle, part of the brain we evolved for facial recognition and essential for social success and all of that. It's a part of the brain that evolved for keeping track of examples of whatever category is most important to you. Another region, anterior cingulate, and you want anterior cingulate in one simple phrase. It's the part of the brain that allows you to feel somebody else's pain. Empathy. We're going to be dissecting that one like crazy and seeing that in some ways what it's about is psychic pain. Anterior cingulate activates when you were being ostracized in that cyberball business there. It's about empathy. Both of those are going to be highly pertinent to a fact we'll get to down the line, which is in major depression, there's overactivity of parts of the anterior cingulate. It is a disease of psychic pain, of feeling the pains of the world to an exaggerated extent. And we're going to see an absolutely wild piece of brain surgery that's occasionally done for severe, severe depression that addresses exactly that. Okay, so fusiform cortex recognizes faces or whatever category really matters to you. Anterior cingulate, you feel the rest of the world's pain, and our sort of final modifier here with this, which is it depends. It depends. It depends whose face. And what studies have shown is when we're looking at faces of in-group members versus out-group members, thems, whatever them counts as for where you come from, when there's pictures of thems, the fusiform doesn't activate as much. It doesn't count as much of a face. You don't remember it as accurately because they are an undifferentiated them. They are a canonical them. They are a idealized, demonized them. The fusiform doesn't distinguish as much. And meanwhile, over at the anterior cingulate, depends on whose pain it is. Take someone, they watch a film clip of a hand and a needle poked into the hand. Just as the needle goes in, your anterior cingulate activates. Oh my God, that's so painful. But as shown in a number of studies, if the hand's skin color is different from your own, as the needle goes in, you don't get as much activation of the anterior cingulate. Whose face, whose pain, we will be getting to all of that big time. And what's implicit in that is work, psychologist at Princeton, Susan Fiske, wonderful work showing that all thems, all out-group members are not the same to us. They fall in different types of thems, and you see very different engagement of different parts of the brain depending on which type of them we are looking at.